I still remember the smell of that summer in 1946, a mix of hot tar, cut grass, and motor oil. The war had ended, but the world hadn't quite figured out what to do next. Everything felt used up. There were shortages of steel, shortages of work, and plenty of men trying to remember how to live without uniforms. Our little town in Kansas had one factory, or what was left of it. It used to make metal pails and milk cans before the war, shiny, solid things that seemed to last forever. But after years of making shell casings and helmet liners, the place was more rust than roof. My father, a farmer all his life, had come back from the war with a limp and an idea. "If we can't afford metal," he told me one night, sitting at the kitchen table under the dim yellow bulb, "then maybe it's time we learned to make something that doesn't rust." He was holding a dented army helmet, the kind he said had saved his life in France. He turned it over, knocked on it with his knuckles, and said, "You know, this stuff's tougher than steel in the right hands." He wasn't wrong. After the war, mountains of surplus gear were being sold for next to nothing. Helmets, canteens, airplane scraps, things that had carried men through hell. To most people, they were reminders. To my father, they were raw material. He bought a truckload of helmets for $15. I thought he'd lost his mind. We melted them down in the old chicken coop behind our house. It wasn't much of a foundry, but it worked. The metal sizzled and smoked, bubbling like something alive. The first few attempts ended in disaster. The molds cracked, the handles warped, the bottoms leaked. But my father never swore, never slammed a thing. He just wiped his hands on a rag, took a slow breath, and said, "We'll get it next time." And one day we did. The bucket came out smooth, light, and, somehow, different. It didn't dent when it fell, didn't rust after sitting out in the rain for days. It wasn't steel. It was something new. We didn't even know what to call it then. Later, the newspapers would call it plastic. At the time, all we knew was that we made something that worked, out of the very things meant for war. Father carried that first bucket into town like a trophy. Folks at Miller's Hardware laughed at him. "A bucket made from helmets?" one man said, shaking his head. "Next thing you'll tell us you're milking cows with spoons." But one man didn't laugh, Mr. Rudd, the feed store owner. He bought 2 on the spot, said he liked how light they were. That was all it took. Word spread faster than we could pour molds. Every farmer in the county wanted one. We set up a line of them outside the house, a whole row of buckets shining like dull gray moons in the sunlight. Mother started calling the co-op the Bucket Factory. I used to think she was joking, but that name stuck. We painted it on a wooden board, nailed it above the door, and that was it. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were making something. Sometimes I'd catch Father staring at one of those buckets at dusk, his hands in his pockets, his face half in shadow. "It's funny," he'd say, "how something built to keep you alive in war can end up helping someone live in peace." And I guess that's how it all began, in a chicken coop, with a few broken helmets, a lot of hope, and the stubborn belief that even scrap metal can be reborn into something good. By the spring of 1947, the bucket factory had become more than a family joke. We were making 15 buckets a week, all by hand, pouring, molding, trimming, sanding the edges smooth. The air in that chicken coop smelled like burnt rubber and dreams. Father had taken to wearing his old army apron again, the one with the singed strap and the dark stains that never came out. "Ain't no use buying new clothes," he'd say. "You'll just ruin them doing something worth doing." The orders kept coming. We sold them at the feed store, then at the farmer's market 2 towns over. Folks liked how light they were, how they didn't rust or leak. But what they liked most, though they didn't always say it out loud, was the story. They liked knowing that those buckets had once been something else, something from a world everyone wanted to forget, but couldn't. One day a man from Topeka came down in a big Buick with shiny shoes and a notebook full of questions. He said he represented a company that made things of value. He asked my father if he'd thought about scaling production, making more, faster, with better molds and proper machines. Father said, "Son, I've thought about a lot of things, but faster don't always mean better." The man smiled like he'd heard that one before. He left a card, shook Father's hand, and drove off without buying a single bucket. We didn't think much of it at first, but a few months later we saw a newsreel at the movie house in town. Some company in Illinois was producing synthetic pails, using the latest materials and factory molds. They looked suspiciously familiar. Father didn't say a word during the drive home. He just stared out the window, his thumb running along the brim of his hat. That night, he didn't eat dinner. He sat out by the coop watching the last bit of daylight fade. When I went out to him, he didn't look angry, just tired. "You know," he said softly, "it's a funny thing. You can give the world something good, and it'll take it, but it won't remember where it came from." I didn't know what to say. I was 17, and all I could think about was how unfair it felt. But Father wasn't bitter for long. The next morning he was back at the molds, whistling under his breath like nothing had changed. "We'll keep making them," he said. "Maybe not for the world. Maybe just for the folks who need them. That summer was dry, the kind that cracks the earth and makes the grass brittle under your boots. The buckets sold faster than we could make them. People used them for everything, carrying feed, hauling water, even collecting berries. We got letters from as far as Missouri. One woman wrote that her husband used one of our buckets to carry milk every morning before dawn, and he swore it kept it cooler than 10. She said it was the first thing in years that didn't rust before the marriage did. Father laughed at that one so hard, he nearly dropped his coffee. By autumn, the co-op was too small. We cleared out the old barn and moved the operation there. The first morning we worked inside, I remember standing in the doorway, looking at the sunlight spilling through the gaps in the roof onto a row of freshly made buckets. It felt right. There was no sign, no ribbon cutting, no big announcement. Just a few neighbors helping us haul molds, my mother setting out lemonade, and Father nodding in quiet approval. A reporter from the Kansas Star showed up a few weeks later. He took a few photos, asked a lot of questions, and wrote an article called The Bucket Factory Boys. We laughed at the name. Father said he hadn't been a boy since Coolidge was in office. Still, that article changed things. Orders tripled. We hired 2 men from town, both veterans looking for work. We built shelves, bought a used lathe, and printed our first paper label, "Made in Elm County, rust-free, built to last." Mother framed the first label and hung it in the kitchen. "You see that?" she said. "That's hope with a handle." It wasn't about money, not really. It was about the feeling that something small could still matter in a world that had been broken in half. About turning what was left behind into something worth keeping. Sometimes at night I'd wake to the sound of the molds clanking in the barn. Father couldn't sleep much anymore. The noise didn't bother me. It was a comforting sound, like progress with a heartbeat. And even though we didn't know it yet, those buckets were about to take us further than any of us ever dreamed. By the spring of 1949, the bucket factory wasn't just a family project anymore. It had turned into something that people whispered about in town with a mix of pride and disbelief. Our buckets had found their way far beyond Kansas. One of the veterans we'd hired, Pete Hollis, had a brother working at a supply depot in St. Louis. He'd sent a few of our pails along with a shipment of tools just to see if anyone would notice. They did. Before long, we were getting letters with government seals, polite, official ones asking about materials composition and production capacity. Father said, "They're not asking because they like the way we sign our name." That summer, 2 men from Washington came down by train. They wore suits that didn't belong in our barn and shoes that had never seen dust. They asked for a tour, and we gave them one. They walked slow, hands behind their backs, nodding and scribbling notes. When one of them picked up a finished bucket, he tapped it twice and said, "Remarkable." Afterward, they sat with Father at the kitchen table while Mother poured lemonade. I watched from the doorway, pretending to read the newspaper. The taller one, a man named Collins, said, "Mr. Turner, the Department of Industry would like to work with you. There's demand for materials like this, light, strong, corrosion-free. We believe your product has potential beyond household use." Father didn't blink. "You mean military?" Collins hesitated. "Possibly. Industrial, construction, federal contracts. We're talking scale, Mr. Turner. National reach." Father leaned back in his chair, thumb rubbing the edge of the glass. "And what would that mean for us?" The second man, younger and quicker, smiled. "You'd sell the rights, of course, the design, the process. You'd be well compensated. The name could stay for a time." "For a time," Father repeated quietly, as if trying the taste of it. When they left, the kitchen was silent for a long while. Mother cleared the table. I could hear the wind outside scraping against the screen door. Finally, Father said, "You ever notice how they never ask what something means to you? Only what it's worth to them." That night he couldn't sleep. I found him in the barn, sitting beside the molds, a lantern flickering beside him. He looked smaller than usual, or maybe just older. He said, "They want to buy the idea, son. Not the buckets, not the story, just the recipe for turning helmets into hope." I didn't know what to say. I was old enough to understand what a big offer like that meant. We could have bought new equipment, built a real factory, maybe even moved to a city. But I also knew what that name above the barn door meant to him. A week later, Collins sent a letter, official seal, typed signature, offering $12,000 for full ownership of the design and the brand. For a family that had been counting pennies a few years earlier, it was more money than we'd ever seen in one place. Father read it once, folded it neatly, and set it on the mantel. He didn't answer for 3 days. On the 4th, he wrote back in pencil, "Sir, the bucket was never meant to make anyone rich. It was meant to make life easier, and we'd like to keep it that way." He mailed the letter without another word. The next week, a local reporter came by after hearing rumors. "You really turned down Washington?" he asked. "Why?" Father shrugged. "Because they wanted the bucket without the hands that made it." The story spread faster than our products ever had. Suddenly, people wanted to shake his hand. Local papers called him the man who said no to Washington. Orders doubled again. We worked late every night, the smell of hot molds mixing with the faint perfume of mother as bread baking inside the house. Sometimes I'd catch Father standing in the doorway, watching the glow of the lanterns through the cracks of the barn. He'd smile, just barely, and say, "That's what pride sounds like when it's busy." It wasn't about defiance. It was about remembering why we started. That fall we made our 1,000th bucket. We painted the handle bright red and carved our family name, Turner, into the side. It wasn't perfect. The paint ran a little, the curve wasn't even, but it was ours. When the local fair opened that year, our booth sat between the cornmeal grinders and the new tractor display. Folks stopped by to look, to touch, to say they'd heard the story. One boy, maybe 10, asked Father why the buckets were called Turner instead of something fancy. Father crouched down, smiled, and said, "Because you can't forget who made it if the name is right there in your hand." By the summer of 1958, I'd taken over most of the work. Father's limp had gotten worse, and he moved slower now, though his hands were still steady when he held a mold. He'd sit on an old stool near the furnace, giving quiet instructions while I poured and shaped. He never stopped showing up. Every morning before sunrise the door would creak open, and there he'd be, coffee in one hand, that same tired smile on his face. "Buckets don't make themselves," he'd say, as if that alone could hold the world together. We'd outgrown the barn by then. The business had become small but steady, 5 workers, 1 delivery truck, and a reputation that stretched further than we ever planned. Farmers still preferred metal, but families, shopkeepers, and handymen all over Kansas swore by our rust-free buckets. Sometimes I wondered if people bought them for what they were, or for what they meant, proof that something simple and honest could still be built in a world speeding up too fast. Father didn't talk about the past much anymore, but every so often he'd run his fingers along one of the old army helmets that sat on the shelf above his desk. "Started with these," he'd say quietly, "and I'll be damned if we ever forget it." The year he died, 1960, the barn felt too big without him. I kept the lights on, though. I couldn't bear to close the place down. For a while the orders slowed. New plastics, new companies, new ways of doing things. But a few loyal customers still came by, and we kept making what we could. It wasn't about keeping up anymore. It was about keeping faith. Decades passed faster than I care to admit. The barn became a relic, the tools went dull, and the molds gathered dust. My son, Michael, grew up hearing the stories but never saw the factory in its prime. When he left for college, I thought the story would end there. But history has a way of circling back when you least expect it. It was in 1994, almost 50 years after that first melted helmet, when Michael called me from Chicago. His voice was half disbelief, half pride. "Dad," he said, "you're not going to believe this. I just saw one of your buckets." I laughed. "We made plenty of those, son." "No," he said, "I mean in a museum. The Museum of American Industry. They've got a display called Innovation in Everyday Life. There's a whole section on post-war America. And there, behind the glass, was a Turner bucket. Gray body, red handle, label still half intact. I couldn't speak for a moment. The thought of something we demade with our own hands, something born from scraps and stubbornness, sitting under a museum light made my throat tighten. Michael went on, "There's a plaque under it. Says, The Turner bucket, produced from 1946 to 1962, made from recycled wartime materials. Symbol of American ingenuity and resilience. Resilience. That word. Father would have liked it. A few months later, I went to see it myself. The bucket was smaller than I remembered. The color faded to a soft gray. But when the light hit the handle, that red paint still caught it. A tiny streak of warmth in a room full of history. I stood there for a long time, people passing behind me, and all I could think was how proud he'd be. Not because it ended up in a museum, but because it lasted. Because it was still doing what he built it to do, hold something. When I got home, I went out to the barn. Most of it had fallen quiet, dust on the workbench, a few cracked molds on the shelf, and the faint smell of oil that never really leaves. In the corner, beneath a tarp, I found one of the last buckets we ever made. The paint was chipped, the handle loose, but it was whole. I filled it with water from the pump and watched the ripples settle under the morning light. No leaks, no rust, just a quiet reflection of the sky, still holding after all those years. Sometimes late at night I imagine Father sitting there beside me again, his hands rough, his eyes steady, watching the way the water trembles and steadies itself. And I realize he was right all along. The world doesn't remember the names on the handles. But if you build something honest, something meant to help, it'll remember you in its own way. The Turner bucket may not have made us rich, but it outlasted us all. Sometimes the things that last the longest aren't the ones that shine the brightest. They're the quiet ones, built by hands that never asked for credit, made in barns that smelled of oil and earth, shaped by people who believed that usefulness was its own kind of beauty. That bucket wasn't just a tool. It was a reminder that even from the leftovers of war, something good could be born. That a small idea forged in the back of a chicken coop could outlive its makers and still hold meaning for someone decades later. Maybe that's what stories like this are really about. Not the inventions themselves, but the hearts that built them. The fathers who stayed up through the night, trying again and again. The sons who learned what pride really means, not in wealth, but in work that endures. The Turner bucket didn't just hold water, it held hope. It carried the weight of a generation that refused to give up, a generation that turned rust into resilience. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we're all still trying to do, to build something that lasts, something honest, something that reminds the world we were here. If this story touched you, leave a like, share it with someone who still believes in small miracles, and tell us in the comments what simple thing from your own life still carries meaning. Maybe it's a tool. Maybe it's a photograph. Maybe it's just a memory. Because sometimes the smallest things we create, the things we build with care, with our own two hands, end up holding more than we ever imagined. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories that remind us of who we were and who we still are.